What if I told you that you were never born, that what you call you didn't arise when your heart began to beat, or when your eyes first saw the light? What if death, that shadow that follows every human being like a silent certainty, is not the end of anything, but simply the exchange of a coat you've been wearing for decades? It seems impossible. It might even feel dangerous to believe it, but there is something inside you, something that has witnessed every moment of this life, that was present in every joy and every pain, that never needed your body to exist. That something is older than your name. It is older than your story. And perhaps, just perhaps, it is older than anything we could call a beginning. Today, we are going to explore a territory that most people avoid because it is too frightening. What happens to consciousness when the body stops? And the answer may change everything. All of us have lost someone, or we have felt that particular chill when thinking about our own death, not as a concept, but as a personal, inevitable, close reality. There is a specific pain in that thought, a pain that goes beyond physical fear. It is the fear of disappearing. The fear that everything you lived, felt, loved, and built will simply cease to exist. And if that fear is real, it deserves to be taken seriously. Not with false promises of comfort, but with a genuine investigation. Because perhaps what truly frightens us is not death itself, but the idea that we are only this body, this name, this story. What if that idea is fundamentally wrong? What if the brain doesn't create consciousness, but only interprets it? This question seems simple at first glance, but it carries within it an existential weight capable of completely redefining what you believe yourself to be. For centuries, materialist science built an entire edifice on an assumption that was never proven, that consciousness is a product of the brain, just as sweat is a product of the glands. But there is a fundamental problem with this theory. Nobody has ever explained how neurons firing electrochemically produce the subjective experience of seeing the blue of the sky, of feeling longing, of perceiving that one exists. Scientists can map where in the brain this happens, but mapping the location does not explain how a physical process, electrical, chemical, measurable, transforms into something completely different from matter, an inner, subjective, internal experience. How does electrochemistry become feeling? How does an electrical signal become the pain of missing someone? This abyss between the brain process and the lived experience is so unbridgeable that philosopher David Chalmers gave it a name: the hard problem of consciousness. Hard not in the sense of complicated, but in the sense of perhaps impossible to solve within the materialist paradigm. And conventional science, to this day, has no answer. So why do we keep accepting as absolute truth something that not even the greatest scientists have been able to prove? Imagine a radio. When you turn it off, the music stops. But would you be naive enough to conclude that the radio was creating the music? The radio was an instrument of reception and transmission. The music existed independently of it, carried by waves that permeate the surrounding space. Now, apply that analogy to the human body and the brain. What guarantees that the brain is not exactly that? A highly sophisticated transmitter and receiver of consciousness, and not its source. Researchers like neuroscientist Pim van Lommel, who spent decades studying near-death experiences in clinically dead patients, documented cases in which conscious perception continued even after all brain activity had ceased. The radio had been turned off, but the music continued. This is not a metaphor. This is scientific data, ignored for being too uncomfortable. But there is something even deeper. If consciousness is primary, if it is the fundamental reality and not a byproduct of matter, then the entire body, with all its biological complexity, is an experience that happens inside consciousness, not the other way around. Idealist philosopher Bernardo Kastrup spent decades building a rigorous argument for exactly this. Matter does not produce mind. Mind is the substrate within which matter manifests. And if that is true, and the evidence points increasingly in that direction, then the death of the body cannot destroy consciousness. For the same reason that breaking a mirror does not destroy the face it was reflecting. The mirror was only the medium. You are what was being reflected. And that, dear viewer, changes everything. Every night, before falling asleep, there is an exact moment when the physical world completely disappears for you, when your body lies still and unresponsive, when the identity you have built over the years dissolves, and yet you continue. This happens every night when you enter deep sleep. The outer world ceases to exist for your consciousness. There are no thoughts, no sensations, no memory actively operating, and yet something remains. Something that in the morning wakes up and says, something that survived the nightly little death without even realizing it had died. If consciousness can pass through deep sleep, a state in which the ego and the world disappear, what exactly guarantees that it cannot pass through physical death with the same naturalness? Go further. During dreams, you experience entire worlds. You interact with people, feel real emotions, experience pain and joy, live through situations that seem absolutely concrete, and all of this happens without the body moving a single millimeter. The reality of the dream is completely constructed by consciousness from within. Not a single atom of the physical world participates in that creation. And here is the question that the law of attraction at its deepest level asks us. If consciousness is capable of creating entire realities during a dream, if it generates rich, complex, and convincing experiences without any material support, why do we assume it needs the body to continue existing after death? The state changes. Reality changes. But the field of experience, consciousness itself, remains as the stage upon which all these states unfold. And now comes the part that almost nobody considers. Neville Goddard, one of the greatest explorers of consciousness in the 20th century, taught that a change in the state of consciousness is a change in reality, not metaphorically, literally. When you fall asleep and enter the dream state, a different reality emerges. When you wake up, another reality presents itself. Each state has its own texture, its own rules, its own sense of what is real. Death, seen from this perspective, would not be the end of experience. It would be the transition to a radically different state of consciousness with its own reality, its own experiential dimension. Like the butterfly that does not remember being a caterpillar, but is the same life in a different form. The frequency changes, the experience continues, and consciousness, always consciousness, remains the field where all of this happens. Here is the true center of everything. The question that, when answered honestly, completely dissolves the fear of death. What exactly do you think is going to die? If we stop and investigate seriously, the answer begins to reveal something both disturbing and liberating. What we call the self is, in large part, a narrative. A story that tells itself continuously built from memories, social roles, inherited beliefs, unresolved traumas, and cultural identifications. You are American or European. You are a parent or a child. You are successful or a failure. You are young or old. They are layers. Layers upon layers upon layers. And all of these layers have one thing in common. They are temporary, conditioned, constructed over time, and everything that was constructed over time can and will be deconstructed. But challenge yourself for a moment with this question. Who observes these thoughts? When you think of something, there is a thought. But there is also the one who perceives that the thought is occurring, that observer, that field of conscious presence that notices anxiety, that perceives joy, that witnesses pain without being destroyed by it. That deeper I existed before the first thought of this morning. It existed before the earliest memory you have of childhood. It existed in some way before all the stories you tell about yourself. Carl Jung, founder of analytical psychology, called this the self, the totality that transcends the ego. Eastern contemplative traditions call it Atman or Buddha. Whatever the name, the perception is the same. There is something in you that was not created by your personal history, and therefore it cannot be destroyed when that history ends. The fear of death, when investigated in depth, reveals its true nature. It is the ego's fear of losing its narrative. The character is afraid that the book will end, but the book, consciousness, the field of experience, does not end with the chapter. You identify with the character of this life so completely that you imagine when he is gone, everything will go with him. But consider you were once a child. That child, with its specific fears, its worldview, its way of existing, no longer exists. It died in a way, and yet you are here. Something passed through that transition and continued. The ego is a temporary structure, a particular focusing of consciousness within a specific context. Consciousness is the permanent field, and what is permanent cannot die. There is an image in the mystical traditions of nearly every human culture, from ancient Egypt to Hinduism, from Islamic Sufism to Christian mysticism, that describes death not as an end, but as a return. The ocean drawing a wave back into itself, the light dissolving a ray back into its source, individual consciousness expanding back into the limitless field from which it was never truly separate. It is not a coincidence that cultures that never met on different continents in different eras independently arrived at the same metaphor. Wave and ocean, drop and sea, ray and sun, in all of them the same principle. What appears individual and separate is, in its essence, a focused expression of something much greater. And when the focus dissolves, there is no loss. There is expansion. If consciousness is the field within which reality happens, then the body is a form of focusing, a lens that concentrates the limitless field of consciousness into a specific perspective at a specific point in time and space. That focusing has a function. It allows for a particular experience, individual learning, the sensation of being this someone in this moment, in this life, but the lens is not the field. And when the lens breaks, the field does not disappear. It simply ceases to be concentrated at that specific point. What we call death may be exactly that, the dissolution of the lens, consciousness, which was previously focused through a body, a name, a personal history, returns to the non-local state, the state of pure field, of pure presence, without the limitations of an individual perspective. Not less, more, much more. Perhaps death is not the end of experience. Perhaps it is the end of the limitation of experience. Think about what it means to exist inside a human body. You are confined to a specific point in space. You perceive time in a linear way. You experience the world through only 5 highly limited senses. You have access to only one perspective, your own. Now imagine consciousness without those restrictions, without the walls of the skull, without the funnel of the physical senses, without the linearity of time, without the echo chamber of the personnel narrative. What would such a consciousness be? The mystical traditions from St. John of the Cross to Rumi, from the Taoists to the shamans, describe it as something that completely surpasses the capacity of language to express. Not emptiness, fullness, not absence, total presence, if we are consciousness. Nothing essential in us can die. And this is not belief. It is the most logical conclusion of a serious investigation into the nature of reality. So what does this mean for you right now in this life? If consciousness is primary, if you are fundamentally a being of consciousness and not a being of flesh, then every choice you make from this understanding carries a different weight. The suffering you carry for things that have already passed, the identities you defend fiercely, the fears that guide your decisions, all of this begins to look different when you realize that the character is temporary, but the being that animates it is permanent. This is not escapism. It is exactly the opposite. It is the ability to be completely present in this life, in this body, in this experience, without the suffocating weight of fear that everything will end. Because perhaps nothing essential ends. Perhaps what truly matters lies beyond the reach of death. And there is something even more intimate in this. When someone you loved departs, when the pain of loss is so great that it seems impossible to carry, the question is not merely philosophical. It is the most personal question that exists. What if the consciousness of that person did not disappear? What if the love that existed between you, which is also a form of consciousness, a vibration, a real frequency, continues to exist at some level beyond physical perception? We are not here promising reunions or claiming to know how the beyond works. We are simply questioning the most painful assumption of all, that death is the absolute end. Because if consciousness is fundamental, if it is the fabric of reality, then love is to... And love, like every genuine form of consciousness, may be far more immortal than we were ever taught to believe. I did not come here today to give you definitive answers. I came here to make you a different offer. The offer to question, to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty and realize that within that discomfort, there is an extraordinary opening. An opening to what you might truly be beyond the name, beyond the body, beyond everything that was constructed and that one day will be deconstructed. The oldest traditions of humanity, the most rigorous philosophers of today, the scientists who dared to go beyond the dominant paradigm, all of them point from different angles in the same direction. Consciousness is not the product of matter. Matter is the product of consciousness. And if that is true, then what you call death is only a door. Not necessarily to what was promised in ancient books, but to something beyond the capacity of this language, this body, this life to fully comprehend. So I leave you with the question that, if you carry it with you, may transform not only how you think about death, but how you live while you are here. If reality is consciousness and death is only a change in the state of that consciousness, then who are you in this exact moment? Before any thought, before any story, before any name. Leave that in the comments. I want to know what happened inside you while you were watching, because this conversation does not end when the video stops. It continues in you. And if this content touched something real, share it with someone who is also ready to question. Every consciousness that expands the whole field. See you at the next level.